you everyone for coming to this morning. I'm going to be speaking about the subjective experience of conducting research in a 6-week faculty-led study abroad program that I conducted in Leipzig, Germany. And so first a little bit of background. I think here at this conference we all know that in recent years there's been an increased interest in identity and language learning. We've seen a lot of talks at this conference dealing with this question of identity and study abroad. We also know that scholars talk about the need to focus on real people and to move away from considering learners as theoretical abstractions. And so, many folks have been doing ethnographic work in applied linguistics, broadly speaking, like Patsy Duff, Stephen Tommy, many others. And a few have started doing that in recent years in study abroad as well. Obviously, Celeste Kinginger, we have a recent publication by Uju Anya as well just came out. And so that's something that's started to make researcher subjectivity a central issue. And so, the question of how do our identities as researchers, our beliefs, our contributions, how do they shape data collection and analysis? And in other words, we want to move away from considering the researcher as at best a theoretical abstraction as well, or at worst not considering them at all in the data. And so what I'd like to do next is show you, how I kind of came to terms with this question and how I looked at this in a study that I conducted this summer. And the first thing that I'm actually going to show you is an excerpt from a chat transcript between me and another friend, applied linguist, who graciously allowed me to show this chat as we kind of talked about what I was going through while I was collecting data in the summer. Okay, so this is, I'm just going to read the bolded yellow part. So I said, yeah, I feel helpless actually, because I can't put myself in their shoes, obviously. That sucks for you and this participant. Yeah, it just sucks. I couldn't sleep last night actually, analyzing everything that I've said, if I've said the right things, if they feel that I've brushed things off, if they feel that I'm on their side trying to help. And he says, might be worth writing that out, exploring that whenever you're ready to do that. There's something missing in study abroad about the emotional labor and so on and so forth. So this kind of was at the very outset where things were happening and I was starting to do interviews and I was collecting the data, and I started to realize that I was struggling, doing a lot of the emotional labor, trying to figure out, how to navigate my role as researcher in this particular context, and was, kind of going back to the literature and seeing what Jim Coleman had written about, whole people, whole lives, and he also had a part of that article where he talked about academic researchers, we're whole people too. And so I was thinking about my participation in a number of cultural communities and, starting to reflect on that. And so, began to write down some identity memos with sort of this kind of talking through with some of my colleagues. And, because the emotions that I was experiencing seemed to be shaping the data collection process. So in struggling and reflecting, I came to understand, of course, that identity is situated in a particular time and space, particular context, is co-constructed in social interaction, and that it's shaped by hierarchies, by interactions within hierarchies, within power hierarchies. And so in this particular project, I'm looking at how I negotiate or manage that, and my role as researcher in interaction with an undergraduate student participant in Leipzig, Germany. To give some context, though, to the larger study that I was conducting, this is taking place in a study abroad program that is a faculty-led program. We've heard a lot about these programs yesterday, very common in the US today. And the program itself is one that is designed and run by 3 of my colleagues and I. And we trade off every year sort of who runs it. So, I had run it once previously, and in this particular summer, I was not running it. But the actual program itself involves these pieces, 8 days in Berlin. There's a language learning component, like in terms of formal classroom and project work in Leipzig. And then there's regional excursions involved in the final week. And the students stay in hostels and dorms. And like I said, a colleague last year was running it. I was there as a researcher. But the year before, it's very important to know that I had run it before and have designed it before, helped design it before. But in the time that I was there in 2016, I was there, as a researcher, right? That was the focus of my being there. And so I had nothing to do with the actual planning or leading of this iteration of it. And so I was there only to collect data from participants, right? And I am a researcher, right? This is kind of the way that I was thinking of it, right? And so you'll see that these were some of the parts of the larger project that I was involved in. But today I'm actually going to focus on one particular interaction which involves 2 focal participants, me and the interactant, the undergraduate student participant Mayden. And I'm going to now introduce you to some important information about myself and about Mayden that becomes relevant in the conversations, in the interactions that we'll look at. So to situate us. So I was the researcher of the project. This is obviously becoming relevant in the interaction. Also relevant is my role as professor of the student back home, also an advisor. My experience with learning German and speaking German and living in Germany became relevant. General age-related issues became relevant. Race becomes relevant, and also gender expression becomes relevant here. My participant Mayden, which they chose their pseudonym. Mayden is an undergraduate student German major, a German learner of 6 years, 20, a person of color, identifies as trans, and the pronoun they is what I will use. And I'm going to be honest about that because it's actually very challenging for me to use they. Not only linguistically, but also because I knew this student before they transitioned. And so this is a really big challenge for me and my colleagues that we're very open about and with Mayden and with other people around us. And also, as is very common, I think, with people going through these major identity changes, there's a lot of issues with anxiety and depression related to this particular person. So in the data that I'm going to present here, you're going to see some, and you're going to hear some interactions from a mid-study abroad interview that I conducted with Mayden right around the halfway point in Leipzig. Some relevant identity memos that I took at the time that correspond to some of the things I'm saying, as well as some excerpt, well, at least one excerpt from Mayden's journal entries, because that was actually a part of the program as well, that they write reflective journals, and I had access to those journals as well as a part of the larger project, and so this is where I have that data as well. So I discursively analyzed the interactions in consideration of the collaborative identity work that was going on, and then brought in relevant excerpts from the journals and memos. Okay, so we obviously see in this kind of data when we look discursively, we see that there's a lot of collaborative identity work going on. This is no exception. In this example, or in the examples I'm going to show you, the researcher, study abroad student, professor student, experience with the language, time and country, and race and gender expression seem to become very relevant here. And so basically one of the big findings so far, this is a very new project, it's kind of ongoing, but what I find is that just as language learners and study abroad do not always orient to one another as learners, which is something we talk about a lot, researchers don't always orient to one another or to each other as researchers, right? We're doing a lot of different identity work as we're speaking with our participants. And that becomes relevant here. And something that I actually want to do to contextualize the interactions that I'm going to play for you today, I want to show you two excerpts from my identity memos that were slightly before this interview and one that I wrote down slightly afterwards, because it contextualizes some of the situations that were going on around us at the time. So pre-interview, I wrote this down about Mayden. Mayden indicated pre-program that they have serious mental health issues. And in all of our earnestness to help Mayden, Dr. C, who was my colleague, the faculty leader of the program, and I find that it can be very hard to know which events really happened to them or were exaggerated without discounting their reactions to feeling discriminated or threatened. So this was something we were already aware of and concerned about and trying to manage, even though, again, notice I'm not the faculty leader, but I'm writing down this as though I'm involved in it, right? And so this is kind of this, I'm the researcher, right, coming in to do just the research, but in fact, there's a lot more going on. After the interview, I wrote down, it's all I could do to try not to explain away Mayden's worries. I clearly cannot understand how they feel in the face of racial and trans discrimination, and I cannot pretend to, right? So this is some things that I was dealing with. Okay, so I'm going to play on the handout. This is excerpt 1, if you have a handout. If you don't, you can listen in when I go to talk about particular parts of the transcript. I will also show those parts on the screen. Let's see if the audio works okay.
Anything like that, so I feel like, I don't know, with all the outside environment, like interactions I've had outside of class with how negative they've been, I've actually felt like the German has gotten worse since I've been here, because I don't want to speak it.
Yeah. Can you give an exact example of feeling threatened, that's something that happened to you specifically?
There's been one guy who's been on the bus twice now that approached another student and trying to kiss us. I don't know if they had some sort of mental issue or severely drunk or what, but it's happened on multiple occasions at this point.
Let me just clarify to somebody in the group.
Yeah, someone in our group, yeah. Another student of color. And it's really just off-putting, especially the first time it happened. He put his hands on her, and I didn't know what to say. Like, I had no words for it, because I literally did not know how to say anything to him in German. I didn't have the language of defending myself. So that's been hard to deal with, not really knowing what to do in those situations, because at least at home, I can have something to say in response. Like, if I'm insulted, I can at least defend myself. Here, it's kind of just like, be called a name and not do anything.
Did you bring it up in class? Ask for vocab about that?
No, I haven't, because we haven't really, I feel like class isn't really like a discussion. Like, we just have material that we go over.
Okay, so some things that are going on here. The first thing that struck me was that there's a lot of interactional back-channeling on my part, so clearly I'm using these to signal that more talk is expected of Mayden, and they develop their talk collaboratively over a number of terms. And you can see also that at these particular points in the transcript, I make 2 requests for more information. And you know, obviously this indexes my membership category as interviewer, which is indexing the power, the rights and responsibility I have to, you know, take turns and to request that information. At the same time, this sort of repeated request for more specific information, especially in light of the identity memo, you know, about the possible worry about exaggerating particular situations that they're experiencing, may index my doubt about what is being told, what is being shared, and so, or that I need more information to sort of understand the context of that situation. So that's one thing. And then another issue that became relevant too here is a previous journal entry that Mayden had written, and I'm going to show that here. The German is up top, and this is Mayden's L2 writing. So this is the original journal entry, and then I've translated it below here. So we have another situation this is speaking about Mayden's time in Berlin, and at this point we're in Leipzig. So this is later, a few weeks later, but this is written back towards the end of their time in Berlin. So another situation was at a queer bar. My friend used the men's bathroom because she's non-binary and he tried to stop her. When she didn't care, he got angry. He called her crazy and said that she has an illness. I told him that this is a queer bar and if he has a problem, he should leave. And he left. And you see this, you know, sort of alternate happy face, right? It's written the other way around. But in any case, this obviously shows that Mayden, in some ways, may actually have the language of defending themselves and their friends, and is actually quite pleased and proud about, you know, the ability to be able to do this on behalf of a friend. And yet, when we see in other situations where a face-threatening act takes place, they're very unsure, and especially publicly, right, unsure of how to proceed or how to actually defend themselves. And that's really interesting because I knew this, and I knew what I had written in my identity memo while this is going on. I'm negotiating all of this stuff in the interaction. And so at the end, what happens is this interaction. I understand that Mayden is done because there's a pause and a and I'm trying to figure out what to do. Okay, so maybe I desire to let them to continue to hold the floor, right, to avoid overtly aligning with the thoughts that they've expressed at this point. But I shift the topic, right? So like I'm starting to, again, index the membership category as interviewer, researcher, but I'm also indexing my membership category as professor and advisor and choosing the topic classroom at this point, you know, because I'm basically positioning Mayden as now a classroom learner of German in an institutional context instead of an L2 user of German in the wild, right? And you can see this as a way to construct the classroom as a safe space to talk about these things on my part, which obviously speaks to my normative experiences of the classroom and education as a safe space. And this is a privileged understanding of educational context. And so, you know, they're obviously resisting this, right, in some way, right, because there's no actual overt alignment with, yes, this classroom is we don't do that in the classroom, right, is basically what they say. So that's just one example of what's going on between how we're basically co-constructing this idea of what the classroom can do in the situation in which one feels extremely unsafe. Another excerpt here I'm going to play.
So can you talk about your experiences in Berlin in terms of like positive, because you seem to associate positive feelings with Berlin and negative feelings with Leipzig, so can you give me concrete examples, like about what was positive in Berlin, like an exact time that something happened where you were like, that was great?
I met with women from a DEFRA, and that was super nice to be in like an all-black women's space, because they didn't really do what I was talking about. They were I came in there and they were all speaking German, and the first thing I said was, I don't speak the best German, and they said, well, we can switch to English, and they would, talk among themselves in German and talk to me in English, but when they were talking to themselves, they would always stop and say, like, do you understand? Do you want us to repeat anything? Like, are there any words you don't understand? Just talking about the culture, what it was to be a black woman in Berlin, which is, I'm sure already hard enough, but then moving to smaller cities just makes it that much worse, So, just being able to share that space and talk about different things, talking about the appropriation of black culture and German culture. We talked about the enormous amount of white people here with dreads and just all sorts of other things that go on, and just, how they cope with it, how they dealt with it. It was nice to have. Going to the number of queer bars, going to spaces where, can't really say queer bars are safe anymore, but going to a place where it was, and that there were other people who were like you, or just not even other black people, but other people of color from like surrounding countries. And there was always someone who's willing to have a conversation with you, or whether they started or you started with them, they just let you join in. I felt like it was a lot easier to make friends and have conversations. And I don't know, I felt like the stares I got there were more of like intrigued stares, while the stares I get here were like, I'm going to move myself away from you sort of stares.
Yeah, it's hard to know sometimes exactly what the stares are for. Because I feel that Germans are more look you in the eye when it seems inappropriate based on cultural differences. And then it's like, it's hard to know what the threat, if it's a threat. Which can be very difficult, I'm sure, to piece apart. So do you feel like the spaces in Berlin that you're describing were like safe spaces for using German?
Yeah, I felt like my German was really Berlin. Like I felt like I was learning so much, I was using it so much, which is like weird because it's like now we're at the school part where I'm supposed to be like using it and learning all this stuff, and I feel like I'm regressing here.
I'm sure you're not. It sometimes feels like that with, just basically with language learning, nothing in a week.
Okay, so there's a lot going on here. The first thing that I noticed right away is there's an ending from the previous topic, because I say, pause, and then there's some self-directed speech where I go, questions. And I remember this feeling because this is a specific situation in which I didn't know how to proceed. There were questions on my sheet that were not relevant for this particular student who was expressing extreme worry and feelings of lack of safety, and so there's this, this struggle to select another topic, even though that is my right and responsibility, and this can be backed up, of course, by what I wrote in my identity memo. The questions I have planned seem so inappropriate given Mayden's current headspace situation, so this is something I noticed. There's also towards the end of this, and that was a huge excerpt, but you really need to contextualize what happens at the end of that piece, where I'm kind of downgrading or giving a different explanation for what's going on, possibly by this staring situation that they're reporting. And so I'm, attempting to make them feel better about things, I'm giving a cultural explanation as opposed to a racialized explanation. And so that's something that's going on. It's, it's hard to know. My laughter, so sort of indexing a desire to align with them on this issue, to soften perhaps my suggestion that it's not maybe racialized only. They respond in a way that doesn't show overt agreement with my statement, but rather that indexes their role as the interviewee, and in fact they don't hold, aren't allowed maybe to disagree overtly, this sort of power dynamic that we're experiencing. I won't go through this in detail because I don't have a lot of time, but in another journal entry they talk about in Berlin quite negatively about stairs, and yet in this interaction they're talking about how the stairs in Berlin were because of intrigue. And so this is all about, again, identity as situated and historically situated, and so you can see the shifts that are happening as they're trying to account for the different places and spaces and reactions that they're having. Repeatedly I'm using "it's hard to know," and I'm desiring to teach them, again, indexing my professor identity, right, about cultural interpretation. And even though they haven't overtly agreed, I continue, right, trying to teach them about this, that this could be some other explanation. And then I have longer pauses. I'm waiting for them to take the floor, as one would expect in an interactional context, but they're not. But they're also not overtly disagreeing, because that's also not appropriate for this power dynamic. At the end, there's a little situation where they talk about regressing their language, feel that their language learning or language use is regressing, and I jump in, again, right as an interviewer to sort of interrupt, jump in, and I'm sure that can't happen, and I'm indexing, of course, my scholarly knowledge about language learning and that language acquisition here as well. Okay, so what is going on here? One of the things that I think is happening is, seeing that the myth of the individual researcher, so this person who, the self-directed study design, data collection, data analysis, and writing, this sort of idea that we're working on our own, we're coming up with an idea, we're implementing it, and we're going back and analyzing it. Well, that's not what's really going on, right? Our research and the interactions we have with our participants are situated, they involve hierarchies of power, and they have real life consequences for the participants, especially in this case where they're already speaking about a person who is marginalized in a number of ways. And so we see that my repeated attempts to actually position Mayden as a learner, as a language learner, is actually problematic for them because, I'm so glad that I just picked up Uju Anya's book, I forget what it's called. It's like Racializing Identities in Second Language Learning or something like that, but I highly recommend it because there's this great quote in the book, and it says, ultimately, the African American student's development in the new language is mutually constitutive of their growth into consciousness of how to do and how to be Black in this new context. And something that Wen Hao also mentioned a little bit here in her presentation as well. And I would add, obviously, the same thing can be said for queer identities, LGBT identities, in the case of Mayden, also identity related to gender expression, and so on and so forth. And so this is the conflict that we're having, right, in the interaction. The implication of this is basically we need more autoethnographic work in study abroad. There's a lot going on in language education. I was talking to Victoria a lot about this the other day at UBC. There's a lot going on here, but study abroad maybe hasn't seen a lot of this yet, and I think it would be really great to acknowledge that we participate and collaborate in interviews and can't be ignored. And also we need more non-white, which is what Anya proposes as well, but also I would add non-cisgender scholars involved in language education and research in order to provide the kinds of research and implementation of research into programmatic support that students of those particular identities would need. Also, just a thought, kind of last thought is, this whole people, whole lives thing. Well, we're also, researchers with lives, and our students and researchers, we have maybe anxiety, mental health issues, racialized identities, and so on, and all the things that I've mentioned here that are obviously relevant for not just me, because I don't have all of those issues that my participant has, but I'm negotiating those things with the participant in the interaction, so those things are affecting kind of our whole system, as it were, and so it's really important to consider. Thank you very much.